Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Classical Academy Podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. Imagine a bus, a glorious bus, full of grumpy people. Imagine people of light, a strangled lizard, a glorious stallion, an entire world that could fit into one of Earth's pebbles or one of heaven's atoms. These are the things of the beloved piece by C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce. And we're going to talk about The Great Divorce with someone who knows this book well. My guest today is James Johnson. He used to teach here at Trinity Classical Academy for 5 years. He just left this year to get his PhD in philosophy at UCLA. We're looking forward to him returning here when he finishes. And while at Trinity, he taught philosophy, Christ and culture, math, literature. He is a real intellectual Renaissance man. He first read The Great Divorce with another teacher here, Eric Margrave, and he was a junior in high school at the time, and Lewis turned him on to literature. The first philosophy book that James ever read was Problem of Pain, and now here he is pursuing his PhD in philosophy. James, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we're classical Christian school. Hopefully classical Christian education is the fastest growing education in the country. So why do we study C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce? What's the classical reason? What's the Christian reason?
Lewis's The Great Divorce is a book that allows us as Christians and really anyone to be able to look at heaven and hell in a way that allows us to see who we are meant to be, what God intends us to become, and allows us to see ourselves in a completely different light so as to be transformed into the likeness of Christ.
So how does he do? What does he paint characters in the book, and we hopefully relate to the right ones? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there are definitely characters that are painted throughout the course of the text that allows us to look at examples that we can emulate ourselves, but there's also the setting too that allows us to be able to see the contrast between heaven and hell in a way that is radically different than ways that we might be familiar with. When we think about heaven, we might think of radiance and light, and there's something true to that. When we think of hell, we might think of fire and brimstone. Maybe there's something true to that as well, but Lewis shows us hell and heaven in a way that is very different than what we tend to expect. And so it shakes us, it rattles us, it allows us to think more complexly and more carefully about the heaven and hell to which we think that we are destined to enter.
Sure. So from a classical perspective, I mean, people hear classics, they hear classical literature, they think Greeks, right? How does this interface with classical literature? In other words, what's classical about it that we would study it here at Trinity?
Yeah, the very first page of The Great Divorce starts with Lewis talking about hell as though it is a place that sells the completed works of Aristotle.
Yes, right.
This is immediately putting him in a position to contrast his view of heaven and hell with Aristotle so as to have us think about heaven and hell in light of Plato himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so that way we can, again, look at it differently than we would normally approach heaven and hell, but to look at it more philosophically, to look at it more classically, to think about historically the ancients such as the great Plato, how he would think about such things as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know C.S. Lewis is well known, but let's talk about the author a bit. I mean, who was he? When was this written and where? What were the circumstances? Why did he write it?
He wrote it in the 40s. Lewis himself, he was born in 1898 and he died in 1963. And so he wrote it in the mid-40s, if I'm not mistaken. And having done so, he had already converted to Christianity, and so he had converted to Christianity after having studied extensively philosophy and the classics with considerable rigor. And now what he's attempting to do is he's trying to show his audience how we can reimagine heaven, how we can reimagine hell in a way that is informed by these classical authors, most especially, I think, Plato.
I know it's a very difficult question to make short, and there's probably a million different answers, but how would you summarize who was C.S. Lewis?
C.S. Lewis was a very complicated Christian. And he initially did not believe in the Christian faith. He was converted, thankfully, by the help of J.R.R. Tolkien. And he became a devout Christian. Having done so, then he later also struggled and wrestled with the problem of pain. He also struggled with the loss of his own wife, and he famously wrote A Grief Observed, where he's trying to come to grips with the problems that arise from thinking about the sufferings that God allows us to experience.
You know, my kids, when we lived in Oxford, they actually went to school at Headington Quarry right next to the church where he and his brother are buried on top of each other. Just a little anecdote there. And so now for the kids out there, and there's kids in all of us, if you're in classical Christian education, what would be the most famous thing that he's known for?
Definitely the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote the series within the 50s, and that too also engages pretty considerably with the classical tradition as well, even though we tend to not think that is so. We tend to read it maybe when we're in our youth, but if you go back and read it in light of the Greeks, in light of the Romans, then we can appreciate it even more so as he is engaging with such pagan gods as Dionysus, as he's dealing with even Anselm's ontological argument, as complicated as that can be, in the Silver Chair. He if you go back to read it, the series, after having looked at the classics, then there's a deeper and deeper appreciation that you don't have the first time around.
What a remarkable author. Let's set the stage. Let's do an overview of The Great Divorce. Maybe you can kind of, obviously, without blowing it for those who may not have had the pleasure of reading it. And by the way, let me warn you, if you ever read it, it's going to be something you read over and over and over again. I called my son during the Christmas holidays right after I just read it again. I said, "You have read The Great Divorce, haven't you?" And he says, "I'm on my 7th one right now." So let me warn you about that, folks. You'll want to keep going back to it. So let's just set the stage here. Overview, The Great Divorce. What are some of the key points, the turning points?
Yeah, I think that one's approach to The Great Divorce is pretty similar to one's approach to the Chronicles of Narnia as well, meaning that you can appreciate it the first time around as a tale that is gripping in its own right, but having gone back to it time and time again, you see different facets of it, you see different themes, you see different character developments that are altogether different than what you expected from your first time around. And when you go through The Great Divorce, you experience this main character, this protagonist, who he starts off in hell, but it's this gray town. And while he starts in this gray town that is hell, then he eventually goes up through a train, or through a bus rather, up to heaven, which are these heavenly glades. And having arrived there, he encounters person after person, and he sees the contrast between their encounter with heaven and the proper experience of the goodness that God provides.
Now, without spoiling the ending, for you, and I guess it may be different for everyone, but do you have a key highlight or two or three that stand out for you when you think about the Great Divorce, something that hits you?
Yeah, one of the main things that I would try to drive home to my students when I would teach this text is that there's this overarching theme of the more being you have, the more goodness you have. And that sounds kind of complicated at first. What in the world does that mean? More being you have, the more goodness you have. But it's actually a pretty simple concept where what he's trying to get at through the course of the text is to show that the more that you behave like the kind of thing that you are, then the more goodness you have. Meaning the more you act like the human that God intended us to be, then the more that we're acting according to his purposes, the more that we're being good. And we see this especially through two characters, I think, in particular. One is another unnamed person who has a lizard on his shoulder. And as he's up in heaven, as he's wandering around these heavenly glades, then he encounters a fiery ghost. The fiery ghost approaches him and asks, "Can I kill it?" referring to the lizard. And this man says over and over and over again, he comes up with excuses. Maybe I can go back down into hell and get a recommendation from a doctor. Maybe it's the case that it's too soon. Maybe we shouldn't jump to conclusions. But the lizard in question is supposed to represent the temptation that this person is experiencing, the sin that this person is encountering within his life.
As the scriptures would say, that so easily grips us.
Exactly,
and it
yeah.
gripped him indeed.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it's a lizard, or it's a reptile, much like the snake in the garden. And so here what we have is this temptation that is making it difficult for the person to fully come to realize the goodness that God offers us. But the ghost that approaches, this fiery ghost, asks over and over again, "Can I kill it? Can I kill it?
Yeah.
Can I kill it?" referring to the lizard.
Yes. Wow.
And this lizard, again, keeps making excuses, and the person keeps making excuses until finally he accepts the consequences. He says, "Will this lead to my death? What if I die?" he asks the angel. And the angel says, "What of it?"
Right. Exactly. Well, what a great place to take a break. I mean, already here I am just talking with you for 13 minutes and 57 seconds or something like that. I just read it and I want to go read it again now. So gang, we'll be right back after this. Welcome back to part 2 of our podcast with James Johnson. Listen, if you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and give us a review. And please share the podcast with any friends or family who could use a friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. Also, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us at podcast@trinityclassicalacademy.com. That's not too tough to remember. Podcast@trinityclassicalacademy.com, or on social media at the Classical Academy Podcast. What did you like? What do you want to hear more of? We would love to hear from you. So we left the first segment with this lizard being strangled. And listen, gang, if for no other reason, read the book so you can see what happens next. And we're going to leave it at that. That's going to leave it at that. But it certainly reflects what C.S. Lewis so beautifully does. You had touched on it earlier, James, that in the way these characters do, that is the way they act, it reflects how they are in being. I mean, we are human beings and we act out of how we are. And he does a great job of that. And so this place of heaven and these visitors who don't really belong there, how does that contrast out?
Yeah, the contrast between the people in heaven and the people in hell is pretty explicit within Lewis. He tries to show that hell is incredibly small. It's something the size that a butterfly could pass over without even recognizing it. Meanwhile, heaven is grand in its size. You have the things within hell are not substantial. They have very little being. They have very little reality to them. They're just sort of like figments of imagination, is the way that he describes some of the people thinking down in hell. But up above in heaven, you have even the blades of grass that are difficult to bend, as they are like, they are not just our typical blades of grass, but for those who are not prepared to experience the reality of being, the reality of goodness that God offers, it can feel like a piercing. It can feel like a cutting. It can feel like a bleeding from the blades. Mm-hmm. And so here, when we get to heaven, then we encounter other people as well. For example, this man named Frank.
Mm-hmm. And do you talk to your students about Frank? Yes.
Absolutely, yes. And Frank is this dwarf who is there up in heaven, and as he is up in heaven, he's looking around, thinking as to whether or not he's going to accept the reality of heaven, accept being, accept goodness, if he is going to become what he's meant to be. As he does so, he comes across his wife prior to his death, named Sarah Smith. And when he does, then his wife implores him. She asks and invites him to accept the good that is all around, to become who he is meant to be. But he refuses, as he holds on tightly to this chain that connects him to what is an actor, what is a thespian, what is, in Greek, an actor or a thespian would be a hypocrite, someone who's not fully what they are meant to be. Mm-hmm. And so he's holding tightly to this fake sort of image of who he is as he's up in heaven, and his wife is asking him, please accept reality as it is, accept what God has offered us, be who you are meant to be. And he's holding tighter and tighter to it. And as he does so, as he makes up excuses, then he shrinks even further than even further than the size than he was before. And as he shrinks, he gets smaller and smaller until he's barely hanging on to the chain, and the thespian or the actor, this hypocrite, this person who is not who they are meant to be, is just sort of dangling him on this chain. He is becoming almost nothing itself.
So as he rejects the goodness of God, he becomes even less of what he was.
Exactly, yeah.
So, wow, with that in mind, how does studying the Great Divorce shape students?
Well, one way by which the Great Divorce can shape students is there's this incredible dialogue between the main character, who is, again, nameless, and his teacher named George MacDonald, who is walking him through heaven, showing him person after person, whereby the main character asks his teacher, why is it the case that some people are going down to hell? Why are they suffering damnation? I see a person who is only grumbling. Why in the world does that person have to descend to the depths? And George MacDonald's answer to that is that so long as she has even a semblance or a spark of being left, then God will do his work and God will come in and he will ignite the flame to make that person who they are meant to be. But if it's the case that the person descends further and further into just grumbling, for how insignificant that may seem, if all you are is a grumble, not even a grumbler, but a grumble, then you have lost your being and you're at a point where you are the ashes that will be swept aside. And so when we come to think about ourselves with respect to the Great Divorce, when we come to think about students engaging with this text, what we want to do is we want to have them shaped in such a way as to become who they are meant to be. We want them to see that God has a purpose for them. And if they decline that purpose, if they reject it, if they run away from it, then they are running away from reality. They are running away from goodness. Just because pleasures may be awaiting them on the other side, they're not the pleasures that God offers, the true pleasures of being who we are meant to be.
Yes, yes. Oh, wow. So what questions for friends and family of students here at Trinity who are reading or have read The Great Divorce or are about to, what questions should I ask my student about The Great Divorce?
Definitely ask students or anyone who's reading it what the difference is between heaven and hell. What the difference is between the people who are coming up from hell into heaven. How are they engaging with heaven? What is the difference between their bodies and the angels who have become accustomed to the reality of heaven? There's definitely a difference when it comes to their reality. And so be on the lookout for that, but also ask them, being in goodness, what has being, what is lacking in being when it comes to things in hell and things in heaven?
Oh, James, thank you so much. I mean, I could sit here all night, go through it page by page, asking you questions, talking about it. But folks, let me just say, read it for yourself. If you have never read The Great Divorce, go out and read it. I don't know how many times you've read it again, because it is so worth it. And James, we're so blessed to have someone like you come and talk about it. Blessed to have people like you teach it and share it with students. And I meant it when I said we're looking forward to you coming back here to Trinity to teach it again, this time as doctor. Listen, gang, thank you so much for joining us on the Classical Academy podcast, presented by Trinity U, a service of Trinity Classical Academy here in Santa Clarita. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petre is our audio engineer and provides our original music. James, again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
So until next time, let's all continue to grow in wisdom, in virtue, and in love and dedication to God. Thanks for being with us.